The 2025 general elections have come and gone, and with it, a major shift in leadership and public sentiment. From campaign promises to voter turnout, there's a lot to unpack about what this means for Trinidad and Tobago moving forward. Joining us this morning to wrap up the general elections 2025 is Mwale Henry, Executive Leadership Advisor, and I'll say quite a lot more under his portfolio. Good morning, Mwale, and welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me. And good morning to your viewers.
It's a pleasure to have you. How are you doing this morning?
Good. It's been a busy cycle, a lot of polls, a lot of analysis, a lot of numbers.
A lot of numbers.
And but it's a new day, and everyone needs to move forward.
Yeah, definitely moving forward, because that is the only way to continue to grow. Let's jump straight into the conversation. Before we get into the polls and the numbers, let's speak a little bit about the dynamics of the general election 2025. From where you sit and from analysis previous and now, what would you say were some of the pivotal factors that would have led to the United National Congress victory?
Well, victory indeed, and congratulations to the UNC. They fought a clear campaign that was built on three strategies: consolidating their base, consolidating swing voters, and suppressing PNM voters. And all three were accomplished. When you look at consolidating the base, you saw the political leader, incoming Prime Minister, intentionally selected her stronghold seats up until the nomination day. So they caught the entire media cycle. The question was, who's going to be the MP for Tabakit? Who's going to be the MP consistently? And that was also to manage internal dynamics and fallout. And secondly, it was a clear campaign that focused on a vote against incumbency. So swing voters are those who aren't traditionally engaged in the campaign. They will only come out to vote for the government, and then they retract. And then when we talk about suppressing PNM voters, the blackface campaign of changing not just the face of the campaign, but the media marketing would have caused what you will call traditional PNM voters. When you look at the numbers in stronghold PDs of the PNM, many would have stayed home and sat out this election.
Now, there's a lot to unpack from that statement as well, because we could probably talk about this all day. But let's get into, as you would have mentioned, the People's National Movement. A lot of people have been saying what went wrong. You just alluded to the fact that there may have been some voter apathy and so much more. Some people are commenting on the leadership transition. From where you sit, from your analysis and conversations, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you look at the most recent polls, public polls that were available, many would have said it would have been a tight race. But when you look at the respondents, there was a clear consistency across all corners that there was dissatisfaction with prices, food prices, cost of living, crime, employment, especially when we talk about employee participation in the marketplace. So those bread and butter issues were key and front and center. The UNC would have placed that as an emotive process in terms of how they would have presented their campaign. But when you look at to your question about the People's National Movement, in polling there's something called social desirable bias, whereby most of the canvassing data that came throughout the campaign would have shown what is called undecided. Once you have PNM voters saying that they're undecided, it tells me two things. One, they haven't bought into what we call brand UNC, and the data shows that there was not a swing of PNM voters voting for the UNC. But secondly, the base fell out. Because when you look at what took place in 2010 with the UNC and what's taking place 15 years later with the PNM, what the PNM did to the UNC then is what the UNC did to the PNM this time, a 32% swing. So clearly there was not just voter apathy to your question, but there was deep voter dissatisfaction amongst its base. So the question now would be, is it structural, meaning a leadership issue within the PNM, or is it performative, whereby they simply need to deliver better next cycle around to their supporters?
One of the things that you just referenced there would have been the dissatisfaction, but also the polls. And we would have seen, yes, everybody said, oh, it's a very close race, it's too close to call, this is going to be tight. But the reality is, on the ground, when you were having conversations with many individuals, a lot of individuals were quite verbose in their dissatisfaction and the choices that they were going to make. Why do you think, and could you explain to us why there would have been that differentiation between what the statistics were saying versus the voice of the people?
Yeah, so, desirability bias, when examining the science of polling, examines where people are non-committal. The reason why people will be non-committal is because the brand of the opposing party or the other choices that are available is not something that is attractive. So I'll give you one key example. The same issue happened during the Donald Trump election. The same bread and butter issues in the US was clear. Inflation, crime, immigration issues. Biden was facing that as an incumbent. Similarly, the PNM were facing the same issues. However, when the political party has either a history or is not marketably attractive, people won't raise their hand and say, hey, I'm a Donald Trump supporter. When they did the exit polls and they asked, who did you vote for in the US election, everyone would have said, none of your business, and not commenting. And Trump would have got more persons saying non-committal versus people saying Democrats. And the pollsters would have identified, if the brand isn't strong, people will not publicly identify. They will identify with the issues, but they will not identify with the party being the vehicle to support that issue. But in the election, they would have voted for Donald Trump as the one who would solve those issues. However, in our Trinidad context, because the UNC ran what is called a marginal campaign, they got enough persons to support them, but they did not have the base of the PNM to cross over. They would have stayed home this cycle.
Something interesting that you just mentioned there, at least from where I sit, looking at the way that our culture has transformed over the years in general, it seems as though you just unpacked what is being now a shift in our cultural identity, because maybe 10, 20 years ago, it was not an open discussion as to who you voted for. It was a very private matter. And it appears as though now that is no longer the case, even to the point where it may be frowned upon if it is private, because you need to pledge your allegiance to one or the other. Do you think this is a trend that is being literally harvested and will continue, and how well is that going to fare for political transparency?
Well, if there is what we call high dissatisfaction, sometimes you will have that apprehension to be very open, or in what we will call a very tight race or a competitive race. Then the pressure is clear to make it clear, okay, where do you stand versus the political dynamics. But the truth is, Trinidad as a society, we are a very close-knit society. And, people say things without saying it, even if they don't declare their allegiance. Whenever an issue is very clear and has national appeal, then there is what the science calls people who want to be a part of a winning movement. So they will identify. So for instance, the PNM would have lost in 2010. They came in 2015. The reason why people would have identified en masse is because of key public issues that create a groundswelling. So people will now feel a part of a solution of a mass campaign. Similarly, now in this election cycle, there was no major public corruption outcry that created this mass upswelling. But there were bread and butter issues that were intimate to people, families, and individuals. And from that perspective, you would have seen people making a personal choice. I'm looking out for me this cycle.
That's something definitely I think has been a resonating theme, fortunately or unfortunately, throughout this particular general election campaign, where people are looking at maybe themselves versus country or vice versa. And one of the things also, as you mentioned, bread and butter issues, we automatically think about families. We think about, let's say, the older generation, those who are in their mid-20s up, who have mouths to feed, education to finish, and so much more. But what about the youth vote? Because, again, it's been a critical component in so many conversations, and many will say it also played a massive factor in what has happened in Trinidad and Tobago, well, what happened rather on Monday. What are your thoughts and comments on that?
Well, when we say youth vote as a segment on new voters, I would compete with that conclusion. Simply put, 52% voter turnout, lower than pandemic period. It tells me that the voting population themselves would have withdrawn from the process. However, when we talk about where did that youth support go, the preliminary data is suggesting that the Patriotic Front would have received that support because as a party, a new entity, how the campaign was run and what was said, for a new party, they would have pulled the highest out of all third parties. So clearly it tells me two things. One, there is space for a third party. And number two, those new voters who would not have, number one, have the history of the partnership, so they would not have been aware or intimately aware of some of the challenges the partnership would have had. So talking about IMF and corruption issues, it would have been a non-starter for them. And then also with the People's National Movement, when you look at the CSO statistics and the youth unemployment and the worker participation in the workplace, they would have indicated clearly that these are core issues. And it being core issues, they would have given the Patriotic Front an opportunity to pledge their support in that direction.
As you mentioned, the Patriotic Front, of course, the numbers that would have come out yesterday, I believe it's about estimated 21,000 or so votes. And for a third party, a brand new party as well, with, let's say, quite a short campaign time, it definitely is something to pay keen attention to. So as we wrap up the general elections 2025, can you share your sentiments on this? Do you think this is the beginning of a change in trend and our political landscape when it comes to embracing third parties?
The answer to that short is yes and no. Yes, in the context of when you look at Tobago, TPP is a new party, and they would have been able to galvanize support. However, the Patriotic Front didn't. And the issue is the breakthrough element for third parties would be being a subject matter expert in one issue. And the science tells you that if a third party is able to be a subject matter expert in one issue, for instance, TPP, their key issue was independence, having more autonomy for Tobago. If you look at the Commonwealth in South Africa, the EFF, they were a new party. They broke through because they had a one-person issue.
Yes, definitely.
And that one-person issue, one-matter issue, was tied to having what they talked about, expropriation of land without compensation. That was their one issue. So moving forward, I believe if I was to advise the Patriotic Front, capture what is your main issue, and that will galvanize support. And secondly, consistency. You can't appear right before a general election. And thirdly, funding. If you have to have that staying power for 5 years, you would require some form of funding to have that staying power so that those who desire a third option, they will see you as a credible option.
Yeah, some critical issues there. As you mentioned, funding, of course, as we know, the Commonwealth Observer Group were here when they had their press conference post-elections. One of the first things they did mention is funding is something to look into, specifically, of course, in the campaign realm, but it's something that we do need to explore as time goes on. You referenced a little bit earlier media, but you also referenced some strategies that we now see have been successful. Some haven't been successful, but one of the things that we all know is that there are a lot of promises that would have come with this. And from where you sit with your experience and with your analysis, how feasible are some of these promises? I mean, I know there are so many to go through, but just in general, what should we be looking out for, perhaps, or maybe even how do we hold accountable those who need to be held?
Oh, good question. So if I had the opportunity to advise this present government, incoming Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bissessar SC, would be two things: manage overreach and overspending. If you are able to successfully manage those two aspects, because having a budget of $63 billion since 2010, the environment is fundamentally different now. So if you are to advance your cause, there would be a requirement to implement your promises in phases. I can guarantee you this election cycle and this administration would not be able to implement the volume of promises they would have put forward to the society. Not that it's not genuine, but the pace of implementation can be slow. And secondly, it takes cash to care. So without cash, there's going to be a fundamental challenge. So what would be required is to be transparent and to do it in a phase basis. And then finally, what would be very key in order to deliver in terms of pace, I think this administration needs to take the mature decision of whatever policies that were previously implemented by the last administration, they should keep them. I know most times most administrations will want to erase, trash, and start afresh, but you will lose time. And if you take the maturity by keeping those policy positions, for instance, there were a lot of great policies for young persons in the Ministry of Youth Development and National Service. So what should happen if you want to bring forth change, instead of trashing, pivot. Mm-hmm. Pivot those programs, you will have faster implementation, and what will be your winning strategy is efficiency in implementing existing programs. You're going to save yourself time, money, and you're going to have the impact that you desire.
I know one of the things I'm also hearing from that is the brand strength that you would have referenced earlier on in the conversation, because you're going to need that buy-in, of course, from the general public when it comes to many people are sitting down waiting just to see you said this, when is it going to happen? You said that, when is it going to happen? Not taking into consideration white paper process and so much more. And Mwale, we could sit here all morning and talk about this, but unfortunately we're almost out of time. So we would appreciate some closing comments from you when it comes to 2025 and what we can look forward to in 2026. 30 seconds, please.
I'm really excited to the fact that we have free, fair elections. I'm excited that if the UNC does achieve a constitutional majority, I would strongly look forward to fundamental changes in the public sector. We need a modern public service to implement and to keep persons accountable. And as a society, everyone looks forward to seeing that process together.
And Mwale, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Hoping we can have you back again soon to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. I look forward to the future.
It's our pleasure. And Mwale Henry, Executive Leadership Advisor, with us this morning, wrapping up general elections 2025, or maybe even unwrapping them at this point. Stay tuned. There's more coming up on the Now Morning Show right after this break.